If the results satisfy, that is well and good. But if they do not satisfy, what then? Will you weep, battered by grief? Or howl, seething with rage? Have you never prayed that time would simply stop?
This is a question posed by Seth during the game's thematic climax. Noah and Mio have fallen in love, and yet they are trapped in an eternally recurrent tragedy. Each cycle anew, regardless of the power and the passion of their mutual love, death presents itself to the couple. Mio is fated to die, and Noah, seemingly, is fated to fall into despair. This context is whence Seth's question originates, and this question is also that which undergirds the world's structure. Xenoblade Chronicles 3 takes place in the world of Ionios, a world created by the converging twin realities of the first two games, in their attempt to reunite. Seth and the rest of Moebius have taken sovereignty over Ionios, born from humanity's desire to delay the inevitable future, and to linger in the now for as long as possible. Ionios has become a world in which time has stopped, in which the now has been made to last forever. It is a world wherein time flows differently and lives die differently. In this world, through new incarnations of Noah and Mio's tragic cycle of love, Xenoblade Chronicles 3 seeks to answer one question: should humanity be ruled by the present or by the future? The kind of existence led by the human inhabitants of Ionios is made abundantly clear from the game's onset. Their life revolves around fighting in order to live, and living to fight. This fighting is divided between two rivaling nations, Keves and Agnus, which both embody that principle in their political structure. All of their civilians are simultaneously soldiers. Their status within the nation is integrally tied to the war between Keves and Agnus. All soldiers are created and born within artificial tubes instead of through maternity. They believe that this means that they are born from the Queen according to the first commandment, believe that their lives exist in service of their Queen. These soldiers spend the first part of their life in training, with the remainder spent fighting in the war. Their lives are short, with most dying during their service, and only few managing to survive until their 10th year, or terms as they are called by the game. After 10 terms, a soldier's natural lifespan comes to an end, at which point the soldier's body disintegrates into light particles. This process is described as returning to the Queen, the promise that every soldier strives towards. The ceremony itself is called the homecoming and shapes the contents of every soldier's value system. To endure and survive until one's homecoming ceremony is held by both nations as the aim of their life, their penultimate value. It forms their standard of morality. The science of determining the code of values to guide man's choices and action in life is called ethics. Its aim is to prescribe, in abstract norms, the principles necessary to maximize the values obtained during an individual's lifetime. The aim of such a moral code is derived from a previously established purpose for living. The moral axiom postulates a standard for and of life. In Ionios, this standard is the homecoming, with the goal of life being to return to the Queen. The ethical code that is maintained by both nations is, however, in direct contradiction with that standard. Within Ionios, the biggest factor that prevents a soldier from reaching their homecoming is becoming a casualty of the war. Kefesi and Agnian corpses are littered throughout the continent to serve as a continuous reminder of that fact. The war itself contributes nothing to the homecoming, it can only ever prevent it. Logically, and thus morally, there is no value to gain from initiating combat with the other nation. The moral code held by the soldiers is at odds with the moral standard that said code ought to be in service of. As such, the moral framework of the two nations of Ionios needs an alternative impediment for motivating the soldiers to continue fighting in the war. The original function of the homecoming was to serve as that alternative, designed by Consul M to provide the soldiers with a prospect of potential salvation at the end of their 10 terms. Originally, every soldier approaching their 10th term would be executed in order to prevent their natural death from occurring. This bleak existence of constant warfare without rewards was replaced by the homecoming, granting soldiers a value and thus a future to aspire to. It imbues them with a sense of purpose and thus hope. And nevertheless, the homecoming is an artificial creation, enshrined as founding tradition by both Keves and Agnus, in order to mask the brute essence of the soldier's existence, to be fodder in an eternal war. Because humans are conceptual, goal-oriented animals, they require a reason for acting, whether this be conscious or unconscious. Any action they undertake must be willed into existence by their own volition as a result of their own belief that this action positively contributes to their held values. And yet, in this sense, the homecoming ethics is an arbitrary system. There is no integration between the nature of the homecoming and the soldier's physiological nature. Nothing about the type of being the soldiers are, i.e., the preconditions for their survival, bears any relevance to their moral system. The fact that the homecoming was implemented only after the start of the war highlights how morally fabricated its insertion was. The homecoming was created by M as a means of giving the soldiers a false sense of purpose, yet the homecoming qua moral ritual has no effect on how the soldiers act. War and killing, on the other hand, the soldier cannot live without. Division and otherization can be named as other causes for why the soldiers fight in the war. Despite the lack of clear reason for why the war is being fought, many soldiers feel motivated out of emotional grievances caused because of the war. Main characters like Lance, Uni, and Tyon each initially refer to the opposing side as subhuman due to their own comrades having been killed by the other nation. The soldiers categorize their enemies as self-evidently evil others, or even animals who do not deserve the same off-seeing rights as they do. This otherization is reflected in gameplay too, with Keves arts recharging themselves after a set amount of time, and Agnus arts do so for auto-attacking, further stressing that these opposing nations cannot be mixed. Both of these reasons, however, cannot be taken as proper explanations for the war morality. The war predates both the homecoming and the death of the Allies. These two factors are attempts at making sense of one's own place within the war's landscape, serving as rationalizations rather than explanations. Emotional and societal indoctrination certainly does explain the motivation behind the participation of some soldiers in the war. Yet it does not remove the fact that survival and morality are disintegrated in this system. To fully understand why the soldiers are fighting, a look at the colony system is required. Both nations are subdivided into separate colonies, each of them commanded by a commander and overseen by a consul. At the center of each colony stands a flame clock, a component of the colony's Varonis, that displays the amount of life force a colony has amassed. This life force is connected to the life of every soldier belonging to that colony, with the health and the strength of the soldiers being dependent on the life force stored within the flame clock. When a colony's life force runs low, its soldiers lose strength, and once all is gone, the soldiers perish in kind. Early gameplay reflects this dynamic by basing combat strength on how full the flame clock is, compelling the player to go out of the way to kill enemies and monsters to increase their combat prowess. Soldiers likewise are urged to keep filling the flame clock, as their own and their whole colony's lives are on a line worthy to fill. However, simply hunting monsters is said to not provide enough life force to sustain a colony. The killing of enemy combatants then becomes a necessary requirement for survival, cementing murder and killing as integral parts of the soldier's existence. This is commented upon by outsiders such as Niall, calling all of the soldiers butchers, or Console X tormenting the main cast over their past as soldiers, claiming that they are no different from consoles using soldiers to kill for them. Niall is not wrong to make this claim. The soldiers are forced into an existence where death is a necessary outcome, with the only variable being whose death it is. They are killers by compulsion, motivated by the desire to continue living themselves. Of course, the soldiers themselves are not to blame for their state of existence, as is eventually rebutted each time the accusation is brought up. Acting under duress, the soldiers are forced into a position of kill or be killed. The soldiers don't decide to engage in the war. Prior to being freed from the flame clock's grasp, Noah had already voiced his own dissatisfaction about the homecoming structure.
We can see our lives written before our eyes. Fighting is all we have. Is it any wonder we lose loved ones, or have to take them from others? All of us. We have to fight so we can go on living. Just who decided that this was how it should be?
A majority of the game's side quests also revolve around the main characters encountering a new colony and freeing it from their flame clock, enabling its soldiers an existence not revolving around the consumption of life. Once freed from the clock's yoke, the colonies cease their military operations regardless of the soldiers' persisting biases against their former enemies. The soldiers of Colony 4, for example, act resentful towards the main party's Agnian members, but still, they do not attempt to kill the Agnians. Once given the choice between life and death, the soldiers always choose life. The homecoming morality engenders an existence where the ultimate goal is to survive long enough to be able to die. As goal-oriented creatures, humans project themselves and their actions into the future to give themselves a reason to act in the present. Yet to the Ionian soldier, only a singular long-term goal can exist, with its attainment resulting in the immediate destruction of one's own being. This consequently leaves no room for other values to exist besides the concrete ideal of the homecoming. In our own real world, where no homecoming or flame clock exists, it is possible for people to hold various goals and values at once, such as writing a novel, starting a family, or receiving a promotion. Because all of these values are aligned for one core value. This core value is life itself, with the goal of life being to maximize the amount of happiness one experiences during it. All of the other values that someone would pursue do contribute to an increase in one's total happiness. As such, when following a rational philosophy, there can exist no contradictions among one's own values. They serve as differing concretes of varying importance that sustain the same state of being. To attain one value, such as publishing a novel, simultaneously contributes to the ultimate value of living a good life. However, this is different for the soldier, for whom the ultimate value, the homecoming, is a singular, concrete moment in time. The result of this is an ethics of exclusion. If all virtue is concentrated within one temporal moment, all other acts throughout life cease to contain meaning. Instead, being takes on a state of survival, rather than a state of enjoyment. As a result, many normal aspects of human existence are not present in the lives of the soldiers. During an early point in Chapter 2, Noah and Mio find themselves looking at a family of grazing Amuidai. Noah observes that all animals undergo change during their life, developing and growing bigger as they age.
That smaller Amu over there. It starts little, but grows over time. Becomes like the bigger one. All the creatures do it. But we never change that much.
Ah,
It's such a basic fact. So why haven't we realized it before?
In this scene, they recognize themselves to be anomalies among other living beings, yet that was only possible after Van Damme showed them that aging is an existing process. Even Van Damme's wrinkles came as a surprise to them. When the main party first arrives in the city, they are also told that humans are not different from other animals. Instead, Monica explains the human life cycle to them.
we are born defenseless, grow up. Then those who find a spouse create new life together, age, then return to the earth.
And the soldiers, who despite their restricted physiology cannot age past their 10th year, are no different from other humans. 4 of the city's 6 founders were either defected soldiers or descendants of soldiers. As it turns out, soldiers do not lack reproductive organs nor the capacity to experience romantic feelings. They can love and create new life. This is showcased with the relationship between Noah and Mio, whose feelings of mutual love are slowly discovered and explored throughout the game's early chapters. As soldiers, they have no knowledge of love, let alone possess the ability to understand it. They require Monica explicating what love is for them to fully become conscious of their own feelings. This shows that soldiers are not butchers. Instead, they are human beings who are structurally deprived of their base humanity. Romance and procreation are possibilities open to every soldier, yet the homecoming morality is absolutist in design. Values that do not contribute to surviving for all 10 terms by filling the flame clock cannot be tolerated. The soldiers have been removed from how it should be, yet they remain the means of returning to that. In his video about Moebius conditioning, Luxin discussed the information that gets implanted into the soldier's brain by Moebius prior to their birth. Besides the sensors such as language, personality and social skills, Luxin also theorizes that the conditioning places a block on their ability to experience sexual and romantic feelings. Prior to becoming Ouroboros, Noah, Lance and Uni had 0 reservations about bathing nude together. Yet when a connection with the flame clock is severed, which Luxin argues breaks their conditioning, the male members spontaneously feel embarrassed about the thought of changing clothes in front of the females. In that same video, Luxin argues that the conditioning is also responsible for expressing the soldiers' critical thinking skills. He uses this as his explanation for why, during the earlier mentioned Amuidai scene, Noah and Mio had never realized why humans were the only animal species to not sexually reproduce nor physically age beyond basic adolescence. As Luxin points out, it is nonsensical to assume that not a single soldier in the at least 1000 years that Ionius has existed has come across a monster giving birth.
That being said, they also don't question why only humans work differently, and why specifically both Keves and Agnus work this way, even though they're supposed to be different, but every other animal-like thing in the world doesn't.
However, Luxin's claim that this ignorance is the result of Moebius conditioning is directly at odds with the essential component of Noah's characterization, namely his moral opposition to the glorification of the homecoming. Noah describes the homecoming as a pillar of husks, a terrible altar built upon countless lives, an evaluation that runs contrary to that of his fellow soldiers. This view was taught to Noah by his off-seeing instructor Chris, who argued that no joy was possible in a contrived death. The essential term here is thought. Noah was not forced into agreeing with Keves, nor was Chris's conviction implanted into Noah's mind through some form of conditioning. Keves simply appealed to Noah's capacity for independent thought, and Noah was persuaded by Chris's words and actions. Noah's persuasion of a view contradicting his cultural zeitgeist highlights his ability to employ critical thinking abilities long before his Moebius conditioning was undone. This is not to say that no soldiers portray a lack of critical thinking skills. The homecoming and the war are accepted uncritically by Lance and Uni. What Noah's independent suspicion of the homecoming morality highlights is that the deficit in critical thought is not a result of a prenatal conditioning, but instead due to the cultural conditioning by Keves and Agnus. Critical thought is an act of autonomy. To question the status quo is to consider alternative potentialities. Yet the absolutist nature of the homecoming system, paired with the constant preoccupation of maintaining one's flame clock, promotes complacency with the status quo. Critical thought is not impossible for the average soldier. Yet the lack of alternatives present in the social consciousness makes it unlikely that individual soldiers will ever critically reflect on their existence. The system of Ionios heavily discourages critical thinking, yet does not neurotically impede it. Noah's comment related to the Amoidai should then be interpreted as one of hindsight rather than an awakening of critical thought. The war is a continuous ontological axiom not to be questioned, made unable to be questioned. It possesses no beginning, no cause for it is given, barring the simple destruction of the enemy. An end is neither in sight nor planned. Measures are taken by both nations to ensure that one does not accidentally demolish the other nation. An apt example of this is the Annihilator, a long-range cannon making use of the annihilation effect to cause immense and immediate destruction. Both Keves and Agnus possess this weapon, yet at no point employ it for combat. Rather, they direct it against non-combatants, such as colonies whose flame clock has been destroyed. Colonies no longer capable of participating in the war ontology. The war is not some means to an end, but an end in and of itself, a self-justifying mechanism that informs the complete morality and goals of those whose lives are caught up in it. The existence of the soldiers is more akin to that of marionettes than that of actualized human beings. The totalitarianism of the colonies lies not within the explicit control of its subjects, but rather the obscuration of any alternatives. Regardless of whether this control manifests in subjugation or obscuration, the end result remains as the erasure of the individual subject. The logical end result of this is espoused by Moebius Y during chapter 6, when Y calls individuality itself a defect. Ideally, the soldiers would have no feelings and personalities of their own, as Y's own colony Omega reflects. The names of both nations, Keves and Agnus, are respectively the Hebrew and Latin words for lamp. While the soldiers belonging to both nations are mistakenly born with the capacity of self-determination and self-actualization, both their physiological nature and social surroundings are altered to eliminate the utilization of said capacity as much as possible. With the flame clocks, soldiers cannot act in a different way, and through the homecoming morality, soldiers do not want to act in a different way. Ionios presents itself to its inhabitants as a legitimate road for pursuing one's values and goals. However, not only are those values either tricks in order to deceive the soldiers, or white lies meant to put their minds at ease, the soldiers also have no agency over their own values. Values are defined by philosopher Ayn Rand as that which one acts to gain and or keep. Because man as an animal depends on self-generated action, rather than the automated behavior of animal instincts, man requires a motivation in order to act. Remaining alive requires a constant process of action. Yet if man does not choose to act, then he will not live. Man is necessitated to recognize life as his ultimate value in order to pursue it. Similarly, if man considers something other than his well-being as the highest value, he will pursue that instead. The values a man holds serve as the determinator for his actions. Consequently, if one's values could be controlled, one can in effect control that person's actions as well. A Kotaku writer called Cold Cronman described Ionios as a deeply dishonest world. Every facet of it is designed to disallow growth and discourage connection. People aren't born, they are made. Through the exclusionary morality of the homecoming system, as well as the biological impositions of the flame clock, the soldiers find themselves unable to both obtain and imagine an alternative morality. Moebius controls the soldiers with their own consent rather than through direct compulsion. Nonetheless, the homecoming ceremony, the flame clocks, the lives comprised out of 10 terms. These factors are all compromises to the nature of human consciousness. The soldier's true purpose is to act as an automaton, an existence of fighting in order to live, and living to fight. Fighting is their raison d'etre, the action that simultaneously fuels and justifies their existence, a circular loop without start or end. It is an existential Moebius strip. Ultimately, everything surrounding the war is a sham, its only purpose being to manipulate the soldiers into obeying Moebius's every command. This brings us to the quintessential scene of the game's first half, the moon scene. At this point in the story, the characters have recognized that the homecoming morality has been fabricated for the purposes of control, yet they struggle to formulate an alternative. The only ethical code they can think of is one they have deemed unethical. Consequently, it is during this scene that the main characters contemplate the possibility that their present existence, and thus the nature of their world, is inherently evil. With no alternative to replace their old moral code, the seemingly obvious conclusion is to declare existence as purposeless, absurd, or evil. Noah's response to this conclusion is a retrieve from the totalizing morality of the homecoming. Instead, he situates the individual subject as the giver of meaning. In order to explain his view, he refers to the words and phrases people often use when discussing the moon.
The world doesn't just vanish because you've closed your eyes.
What?
The moon. Think about it. Why is it that the moon shines? Just because we're watching? Of course not. Even if humans were gone, it would shine on, illuminating the land beneath. And yet, we're the ones that give meaning to it. We say bit dim tonight, or looks brighter than usual, eh? Similarly, we can now imbue the world with meaning or change it.
Such descriptions of the moon and the ways that people talk about anything else beyond the base material specifications of that object is a value description inserted into reality by the individual. It describes not an exterior object, but instead that object as framed through a person's own beliefs and values. When said individual perishes, the object of value remains within the world, yet the value attribution disappears alongside the individual's existence. Meaning is not a property intrinsically present within our surrounding world. Such an assumption would be absurdist, akin to expecting a car to do one's laundry. Instead, the proper view of meaning is as a quality assigned to something by a human individual. The moon is not beautiful, it is beautiful to me. This qualification for values, the question of a value to whom, holds true for the selection of a partner, a friend, or something as mundane as what food one eats. Values can only be values when put in relationship to the qualifier of values, that being an individual's own life. Life is the standard for morality, particularly human life, as only in the context of living can meaning and thus value be assigned. This counters the homecoming ethics, which enforces returning to the Queen as an intrinsic good to which any soldier ought to aspire. Noah's teacher Chris likewise rejects the homecoming and the 10-term expiration date for the soldier's life on these conditions, stating that there is no joy in a contrived death. To Chris, a death that is not of one's own choosing is wrong. He ultimately follows up on this praxis by choosing the conditions of his own demise. During the moon scene, Noah applies his mentis logic to values as a whole. Values are wrong when they are determined for you, as they cannot exist without you. The moon is outside of your own existence, but the moon is not romantic outside of your individual value judgment. As such, it becomes the responsibility of every human to attribute meaning to the world around them. This is the fundamental decision made in the game's first half, the choice whether to assign meaning to reality or have it be assigned for you. At this point in time, the characters cannot yet formulate what they desire to imbue with meaning. The discovery here is not one's object of value, but instead the critical ability to not accept what one is given. This is the crucial step. One cannot create one's own values without discovering that they are the one who values. This theme is further developed following the World is Evil cutscene, first with Ethel and Kamorafi rebelling against the orders given to them by Moebius, by instead dueling between themselves as their final purpose in life. To Noah and Mio, this final desire is ridiculous, as to them the goal of life ought to not revolve around fighting and killing. Regardless, this is an evolution from what came prior. Ethel and Kamorafi chose to duel to the death. They were not forced to. They imbued their final moments with their own values rather than acting in service of another's. This reframing of how to value even echoes during the final confrontation with Seth, when Noah asserts the importance of a world with the freedom to choose, which Mio consequently puts in contrast to the reality of Ionios being a hollow world of fiction. When the main cast then comes in first contact with the residents of the city, Noah and the rest learn the existence of alternative values of life as it ought to be, to paraphrase Monica. It is in the city where the soldiers learn about the natural life cycle of a human being. The core value of the city, as espoused by Monica here, is the creation of new human life by the old, and consequently of the old both protecting and guiding new life to replace their roles when the old inevitably dies. This principle stands in stark contrast to the world created by Moebius for the soldiers, one in which every soldier lives the same kind of existence every lifespan anew. The soldiers themselves are not aware of this eternal loop that their souls are trapped within, so they attempt to live their lives as if it was their only chance, attempting to find meaning within it. However, the way they have placed meaning is qualitatively different from the city people. Meaning for the soldiers is created by living towards their own homecoming, their own expiry date, whereas to the city dwellers it is generated through raising the next generation of humans. It is destruction on one side versus creation on the other. Soldiers are not incapable of giving birth to new life, but once again, they cannot conceive of this as a possibility for them. Only due to receiving their Ouroboros powers is the main cast able to critically reflect upon their existence as soldiers. These powers also allow them to come into contact with the city people and consequently learn about alternatives to the homecoming system. Ouroboros is what allowed them to escape the confines of their predetermined existence. For this reason, Noah claims that their group as Ouroboros represents hope. The hope of creating a future in which soldiers are freed from the shackles of the homecoming system and eternal Kevesi-Agnian war, an unwritten future to be filled according to one's own judgment. This hope is not a desire for a particular future, but rather the hope that one will be able to make the most out of their future. The moon scene is integrally connected to the notion of Ouroboros as a symbol of hope. One cannot take accountability for meaning generation, for projecting their values into future behavior, without the assurance that the future is theirs to shape. In order to realize opportunities, the recognition that they are possible has to be made first. Only by becoming Ouroboros were they able to make the mental shift into recognizing the meaning of the moon, namely, that meaning not only is to be created, but can be created. The hope of Ouroboros is of realizing such a future. Not a future where their specific values have been created, but instead where everyone is free to realize their personal values. Nietzsche's aphorism about polytheism and monotheism from the gay science makes for a great comparison point to further understand the meaning of the Ouroboros' hope. In this aphorism, Nietzsche describes the polytheistic world as a multitude of norms. The one god was not a denial or a blasphemy of the other gods. It was here that individuals were first permitted. It was here that the rights of individuals were first respected. The inventing of gods, heroes and supermen of all kinds was the inestimable preliminary to the justification of the selfishness and sovereignty of the individual. The freedom which was granted to one god in respect to other gods was at last given to the individual in respect to laws, customs and neighbors. Nietzsche's famous declaration of the death of God is properly understood not as a theological statement, but as a moral one. This aphorism needs to be read in the same light. Most essential about this passage are not the concrete notations about polytheism as a cosmological ordering, but rather Nietzsche's advocacy of a plurality of ethics. By appreciating the existence of various gods at once, in this aphorism substituting for the notion of ethical premises as such, human individual lives accordingly become sovereign from the edicts of others. If moralities are allowed to coexist horizontally, laws and customs can no longer be declared as universal due to the fact that they intend to impose a certain kind of morality upon the individual. A law based upon one ethics, or in the symbolic phrasing of Nietzsche's aphorism, the worship of one god, cannot be employed for the control of other people under the recognition that other moralities exist. It is based on these qualities that Nietzsche critiques monotheism, describing it as the rigid consequence of the doctrine of one normal human being, consequently the belief in a normal god, beside whom there are only false, spurious gods. By invoking the existence of the one god, of a singular code of conduct, alternatives are declared invalid. This leads to the non-conforming human subject, whether they be a polytheist or a rival monotheist, being opened up to control and discipline, all justified by the totalizing ethos of monotheistic morality. Ouroboros represents Nietzsche's ideal of the open-ended, prototype setup of morality, applied temporally. Founded on a hope in the future, Ouroboros fights in order to free up future potentiality for each individual to allow them to design their own coming acts. Ouroboros' hope allows for a polytheistic view of what is to come. If the future is uncertain, unbound by fate, yet still within our control to shape, then a multitude of futures is possible. As such, the future is ontologically polytheistic, and because Ouroboros' ultimate goal is to create a future with the freedom to choose, it becomes ethically polytheistic too. The future is open, and your future is your right to determine. If Nietzsche's moral polytheism holds that the moral contents of man's life are his own to determine, rather than something to be imposed upon him by an external factor such as the law, customs, or a fabricated deity, then temporal polytheism is that principle applied to future-oriented action. It asserts that the future is an undetermined temporal realm at the present moment, whose nature can only be predicted rather than definitely stated. Temporal polytheism as a concept invokes both the uncertainty of the future and the alterability of the future. At once, The future can never be definitely calculated, only predicted, and the future exists in a state of potentiality rather than actuality, with every possible future existing only as a hypothetical to become real rather than being real. This outerability is embraced by Ouroboros, as the game insists that every human deserves the freedom of attempting to manifest a future of their own choosing. The particular meaning that Nietzsche gave to polytheism in his aphorism, as well as its intertwinement with Xenoblade Chronicles 3's notions of hope and the future, is important not only to understand the ambitions of the main cast, but also for beginning an analysis of the other half of the central conflict of Moebius, the thematic and narrative force to Ouroboros and to their hope. It is because of Moebius that Ionios was created, and it is for the preservation of Moebius that the war, the flame clock and the homecoming were invented. As I discussed at the start of this video, Ionios and Moebius were created by Origin during the collision between the two universes, as a result of humanity's collective apprehension towards the future. Moebius should be understood not as agentic individuals, but instead as embodiments of affect. The majority of Moebius are individuals recruited by Set, but the original 3 Moebius were manifestations of a specific existential attitude. Although those manifestations take on individualized shapes with their own personality traits and names, those characteristics were all conditioned by Origin to align with the collective fear of humanity. The recruited Moebius are avatars acting in favor of that affect, yet Set exists as a purely affective being, or as the distilled embodiment of a certain affect. This affect is described by Set as the desire for what he calls the eternal now. This eternal now is best understood as a metaphysics of stasis. Stasis denotes the quality of stationariness or inalterability of an object. For something to be static is to apply its state in the present to every temporal point of the future, which functionally entails a complete lack of change and development. To then call the eternal now a metaphysics of stasis indicates a world whose future is identical to its present. The name Ionios already reflects that stasis, being derived from the Greek term aion and meaning to be of eternity. The societal structure follows the promise set by the world's name. The war is artificially kept perpetual, with neither side losing significant ground nor resources to the other side. The soldier's life cycle of continuous death and rebirth likewise is designed to keep the same group of souls in rotation. The homecoming morality prevents the attaining of values during a soldier's life, further keeping their lives stagnant and unchanging. On the metatextual level, Ionios also shows no progress beyond its parent worlds of Ulrest and Bionios. Instead, it incorporates the same landmarks as its predecessors into its landscape. The 2 key landmarks of Ionios, being the Urian Mountains and the Great Sword, are slight aberrations of locations already found in Xenoblade 1 and 2. 1,000 years have passed in between Future Redeemed and Xenoblade 3, with soldiers still trapped in the same loop of death and rebirth, fighting the same war as they unwittingly always have. The purpose of Ionios was to eradicate the possibility of change. Our understanding and experience of time are deeply integrated with how human bodies situate themselves in space. Philosophy professor Leonard Peikoff has defined time as the measurement of motion. As such, it is a type of relationship. The type of relationship mentioned here by Peikoff is the one between 2 or more different processes or motions. For example, for a year to pass, the Earth needs to have completed a revolution around the Sun. The function of time as a concept is to serve as a comparative tool between 2 different movements within space. As such, time denotes both action and change. Because the progression of time is dependent on changes in space, the concept of eternity is consequently one of spatial changelessness. For this reason, Peikoff calls the universe as a whole eternal. Because no standards outside of the universe exist, there is no motion that the universe as a whole can be compared to. This statement is only applicable to the universe as a whole, however. Everything that exists within the universe is part of its totality, and as such, its motion, or lack thereof, has another motion that can be compared to it. Time passes within the universe, but there is no time apart from that. This also means that the eternal now, Paionios, cannot be understood as a proper eternity. The very potentiality of material action and change necessitates temporal fluctuation, which in turn denies the categorization of eternity. Within Ionios, a day-night cycle still takes place, soldiers still grow older and die of old age, molecules still constantly shift in their relative positioning. Rather than as a proper eternity, the eternal now has to be viewed as a simulated eternity. Let's explore what this means exactly. The ontological goal of the eternal now is to make human existence itself eternal, to make the now last forever, as Seth puts it. The core contradiction at play is that life is defined as self-generated action. For something to be alive, it needs to be constantly maintaining its own construction to prevent its own death. Its existential state is the opposite of inanimate matter, which lays dormant unless acted upon by external forces. Meanwhile, living creatures are imbued with vitality. They have the ability to animate their own bodies, yet this ability has to be sustained. A living being cannot remain alive by doing nothing. An animal, for example, needs to continue consuming food and converting that food into energy to allow its body to keep moving. Non-activity will produce a dearth of energy, consequently resulting in the body losing its ability to remain animating itself, resulting in death. The notions of action and change are inherent and inescapable parts of the phenomenon of life. To stay alive is to act, yet to act is to undergo a change. To talk about eternal life, then, amounts to a contradiction in terms. To account for this, the eternal now creates a reality founded on living eternally rather than being eternally. Ionios is a world where the same war and same lives are perpetually kept in motion. On the individual level, things change every day as the soldiers grow in age and develop their minds. Yet on a macro level, no alteration of Ionios occurs. Even if change cannot be eradicated from living itself, by limiting which actions the soldiers can engage in, their actions can be funneled to always achieve the same outcome. It is to these ends that the war and the homecoming morality reveal the essence of their regulatory power, through ensuring that these two facets of a soldier's existence, one physical, the other psychological, are uncritically accepted as the way the world works. The status quo can be ensured to become unchanging. This is a simulated eternity of Ionios, a world where the future is perpetually eliminated by ensuring that the future will be functionally identical to the present. It is not an eternity of stop time, as Seth professes during the final boss fight, but an eternity of standardized action, standardized movements, and thus standardized outcomes. Ionios aims to simulate eternity, but this is only apparent on a macro level. On the micro level of a soldier's life, reality is perceived as a temporally normal one. They are only aware of their current life, while time continues marching forwards for them. For them, the eternal now is not eternal. This invalidates Seth's first justification for the eternal now, that, with a turn of the clock, it lets everyone eventually accomplish their goals, while it does allow for virtually infinite attempts at succeeding in life. Only one of those attempts can be known by the soldier at any point. Past success does not diminish the current suffering, nor can current success make up for the suffering of a past life. In conclusion, the eternal now is not only not eternal, but also its promise of eternity is not compelling to the soldiers. Instead, the true benefactors of the eternal now appear to be its avatars, namely Moebius themselves. Their psychological disposition reflects true eternity more accurately as well, as opposed to the earlier discussed simulated eternity. Through their behavior in the game, both during the main campaign and the optional side stories, it becomes clear that their perception of reality differs from the average person. When talking about the current fight that they are engaged in, or about the soldiers they command, the Moebius speak using the vocabularies of theater, narrative analysis, or playing chess. During one battle between two opposing colonies, their respective consoles mimic the flow of the battle through a game reminiscent of chess. Upon losing, Console R vents her frustration by calling the slain soldiers useless pawns, while the victorious Console V mocks the soldiers for being dramatic about their own deaths. The winner is then allowed to drink a glass filled with life energy. The lives of the soldiers are treated by the consoles as board pieces in a game, as characters in a fictional story. All of these vocabulary choices made by the consoles hint at a degree of cognitive derealization and alienation from the currently engaged in activities. This is not a detachment of someone who perceives reality as not existing, but instead that of someone who believes the events of reality are of no importance or impact to their being. The consoles act as if nothing external can affect them, as if they were invincible. Their cognitive dissonance from reality is explained by their role as avatars of the eternal now. Unlike the soldiers who continuously live and die, a Moebius' existence is eternal unless acted upon by external agents. No actions need to be undertaken to maintain its existence. External reality can only matter to the individual because it is a source for change, yet Moebius truly aims to live in an eternal matter, which automatically collapses any interest in external reality. In a proper value framework, only that which sustains or benefits one's existence is of importance. For the eternal being, nothing can be of importance, as nothing can be a benefit without also inducing change. Without change, an eternal conscience is put into the role of a spectator. This is reflected in the main base of Moebius, which is an amphitheater. Multiple times throughout the story, the game cuts from a specific scene directly to various Moebius watching that scene through the theater's screen. During the chess game between consoles V and R, this screen is used as a projector to display what is happening to the game pieces in the real world. In the earlier mentioned scene where Noah and Mio are watching someone die, the conversation is abruptly paused as the camera moves to a group of 4 spectating Moebius. They make comments about the fates of the leading characters akin to how moviegoers speculate about upcoming plot beats, rather than that of characters personally involved in what they are watching. Particularly N's detachment from the experiences of his other self is striking here. To be Moebius and to exist within the eternal now means to exist in a form of unchanging, purposeless stasis. This type of being is directly at odds with the generation of values, and yet Moebius combats Ouroboros' attempt to end the eternal now. Clearly, the perpetuation of the now is something they desire to gain and keep, ergo, they consider it to be a value. Yet what type of value does it offer? Such excuse that it allows everyone to succeed in life has already been proven as illegitimate. Furthermore, the first half of the fight against Set ends with Noah declaring all of Moebius is a sham, coinciding with him piercing the stage with the sword of the end, shattering the whole amphitheater as well as the physical forms of the Moebius inside. Emerging from this is Set's true form, a floating head of purple energy fluidly morphing between the faces of people. M tells the party that this being, called Set Infinity, is neither Set nor Moebius, but instead a single intense desire for the now. Now that the sham is over, Set Infinity is capable of elucidating the true motivations between the eternal now.
When you cannot choose, what then? In that desperate moment, who will be there to soothe you? The self is all that exists. As such, the only cure for despair is total oblivion. That is the face of the world.
This response replaces the benevolence of Set's own explanation with feelings of apprehension and worry towards the future. As the perpetually not yet here, the future has an inherently uncertain status. The emotional core of Set's Infinity's complaint is despair at the future that is perceived to be monstrous. It is this despair that the Eternal Now aims to cure. To grasp what despair fully means in this context, I will turn to a close analysis of M and N, the Moebius counterparts of Noah and Mio. As humans, N and M once fought for the future of the people of Ionios. During this time, they managed to successfully escape their lives as soldiers, give birth to a child, and eventually die a peaceful death after the 10 terms were over. During this lifetime, Noah and Mio were able to live out their lives with their loved ones while also leaving behind a descendant. According to the Noah of the main story, this life should have been enough to N. And yet it wasn't. After N's death, he finds himself greeted by Set in the amphitheater, where he is given the choice between the future or the present, between Mio's demise or murdering their offspring and all other city people. After choosing for the latter, Noah has become N and the revived Mio finds herself become M, both doomed to existing as eternal Moebius in the now. Immediately, M lashes out against N for his decision. Afterwards, she laments not being able to end her life anymore. N, meanwhile, has been overtaken by a grief he is refusing to recognize. Despite succeeding in resurrecting his wife, N himself is effectively a husk, a person bereft of a soul. The look in his eyes has become emotionless, and following this, N's behavior also changes.
Oh, then let me teach you. I'll drag you with me. Deep into the void, to the depths of despair!
He no longer shows compassion or love for M, the person who he sacrificed the future for. He instead adopts the same traits as other Moebius, such as a desire for cruelty. Particularly, he takes pleasure from tormenting Noah, who as an Ouroboros represents everything N has left behind. N takes enjoyment from proving to Noah that his hope in the future is doomed. He calls Noah his long shadow, with Noah embodying everything that N has abandoned to maintain the eternal now. For N, the desire to see Noah fail is not mere cruelty, but a psychological necessity. Seeing his reincarnated past fail would validate his decision to abandon the future by reinforcing that it is impossible to have a future with Mio. Deep down, N knows that he made a mistake. M sacrificed her own existence to help N realize this, and during the final fight against him, Noah emphasizes that regret controls N. At the same time, N cannot conceive of a future where he lives together with M. If he were to admit to the eternal now being wrong, that admission amounts to condemning the totality of his own being, both in the present and in the future. Still, his refusal to acknowledge his own mistake does not erase that mistake. N prioritizes the eternal now over the future for one reason: to prevent his time with Mio from ending. However, what he acquired is not Mio, but Moebius M. The game makes a point out of differentiating between M and Mio when Mio tells N that all M ever wanted was to be called by the name Mio, and that M wanted N to return to the name Noah. By becoming eternal, M and N lost their personal names in exchange for what is effectively a serial number. The emphasis put on them losing their names indicates that they are different people now. This is further corroborated in the song A Step Away, which highlights how the love between M and N is a thing of the past. Lyrics such as "I thought I would be forever by your side, protecting you," and "I see you smile, pretending everything is alright, but it made me feel more in misery," emphasize the gap between N's desired outcome and the reality of the eternal now. The lines "I thought I could do it all, I had my confidence, but now I am left alone with no one by my side," continues this line of thought by stressing that N is completely alone, even while M is on his side. Other lines mention that N has lost it all except the memories, and that Mio is gone, and yet her love is still embracing him. A Step Away makes clear that the revived Moebius M is different from the Mio loved by N. She is a memory of his love for her rather than a real thing. As Noah and Mio, the two had fallen in love with each other because of the values the other person represented, but as M and N, those values are absent, made impossible by design. By collapsing the possibility of attaining values by turning themselves into Moebius, M and N lost the ability to maintain them as well. With no values to attain, they exist as zombies, as moving bodies with nothing to move towards. To M, this state is evident, yet also something she cannot change. M, meanwhile, is too fearful of a future without M to allow himself to recognize his mistake. As Moebius, the love between M and N has become a chimera, a distorted creature formed by incongruous parts. As a value, love necessitates change, action, and thus the future. To love someone, they need to do and be something worth loving. Yet in eternal now, one can only be. N decided to freeze time to maintain his love for M, but in doing so, he accomplished the opposite. No values can be maintained when those values lose both their reason and structure for being. Eternity has turned the love between M and N into an impossibility. The final outcome of their mummified love is M's decision to swap bodies with her Ouroboros self, allowing her to move on in Mio's stead, but also sending a message to N. Speaking through Mio, M makes clear with her death that she didn't want forever. She wanted to be there with N, and later, during the origin fight against N, this line of thought is further repeated and elaborated upon. When Mio says that M wanted N to go back to the name Noah, she wanted N to call her by the name Mio. Cursed with her undying Moebius body, her solitary source of escape came to M during Mio's homecoming, the ceremony originally devised by M to allow for hope to manifest in Ionios' despairing samsara. And yet, N disregarded these words as something that M could never have said. His response was to resolve to restart his and Mio's clock, assuring that their partnership would last for all time. Standing in front of a void, as N believes his position to be, N is incapable of reconciling his regret or his despair. His despair tells N that the future without M is catastrophic, leading to his embrace of the eternal now. And yet, once accepted, his guilt over abandoning the future has further frozen him in place, as he believes that redemption is no longer possible. N represents the accuracy of Set Infinity's claim that the only cure for despair is to annihilate the self. Yet this annihilation proved to cost N everything that belongs to the self, including his love for Mio. Ouroboros and Moebius, then, represent opposite perceptions of projecting meaning into the future. One imbues it with hope, the other with dread. Both make existential claims about what it means to be a human, and do so through exploring them within a temporal framework. Time impacts human existence, not only in an existential manner by making it possible to strive for change and thus values, but also in an existentialist manner. Someone's interpretation of the future will influence their behavior within the present, because that future becomes imagined within the present. If a future is imbued with potential, then present action will strive towards that future, whereas a future perceived as apocalyptic is replied to with avoidance, prevention, or denial. Moebius pursues the most extreme variant of these responses, opting to freeze time and indefinitely delay the future. Ultimately, this response is the same as the more realistic responses, at least in kind. The present is seized and reformed to prevent the coming of a future. In the case of Moebius, the opposition is to the concept of futurity itself, which has been equivocated with death and decay, with the death of the self. Moebius is incapable of imagining an alternative future, one in which the loss of a specific value may be mitigatable. Instead, despair defines their perception of the future, transforming the future from potentiality into imminent disaster. To prevent the loss of values, the eternal now was willed into existence, yet for N and M, it becomes clear what the relationship between values and the eternal now is. Here, eternity and death converge together like two ends of a horseshoe. Neither realm of being possesses the capacity to sustain values, because they only allow for an unchanging, ahistorical mode of existence, rather than the constant process of becoming and development that is instrumental for the possibility of gaining and keeping values. The death premise, as that which compels action, reigns supreme. Eternity paradoxically flows into nihility through the mutual rejection of the possibility of death. From the perspective of values, of existing as a living, self-sustaining being, to exist eternally is experientially identical to not existing at all. Non-existence permits no action, eternity promotes no action, with both denying the obtaining of values. Rather than freezing values in place to prevent their destruction, the Eternal Now instead demolishes the foundations for value generation as such, and equates the future with the void, yet the world he replaces it with, Ionios' atemporal reality, is as much of a moral void. When Set Infinity claims that the only cure for despair is oblivion, he is referring to the oblivion of values. Despair as an emotion is a result of the prospect of values disappearing. As such, despair requires values to exist. Without a future, there are no values to possess and thus no despair to be experienced. And yet to exist means to value, to pursue and to attain them. Hence at Infinity's final proclamation that he hates the state of the world. He is forced by reality to nullify his own existence in order to cure his despair. Driven by the fear of nothingness, a reality that eschews nothingness is inaugurated by removing the living from living being. A world with no time and no change, Ionios is a reality of nihilism, formed for the sake of destroying values while recruiting its defenders under the guise of protecting those same values. Ouroboros strives towards the future because it believes that values can be achieved. By opening up the future, it enables anyone to pursue those values. Moebius, meanwhile, avoids the future because it believes values can only be destroyed in the future, and thus elects to remain in a permanent present, devoid of values. Temporally, Ouroboros is polytheistic, whereas Moebius is monotheistic. In the realm of values, Ouroboros remains polytheistic, but Moebius has become unable to project values into the singular future they perceive to be possible and has become morally nihilistic. Ouroboros contains the attributes of hope, choice and purpose, whereas Moebius represents despair, bondage and destruction. Based on this, Xenoblade Chronicles 3 appears to unequivocally support Ouroboros and denounce Moebius. Yet during the final fight, this conclusion gets complicated when the main characters recognize that every person has some degree of Moebius within themselves. This is aptly visualized by Set Infinity's shape, shifting into the faces of whichever character is talking during that moment in time. Moebius is an idea and a desire. Furthermore, it is also one the game does not portray as wholly negative. Both Ouroboros and Moebius are represented by symbols of infinitude, serving as visual encapsulations for their respective factions' attitude towards the future. They reflect the temporally existential attitudes advocated by both sides. The Ouroboros is a snake feasting on the end of its own tail, continually devouring itself and being reborn from itself. The Ouroboros expresses the unity of all things, material and spiritual, which never disappear but perpetually change form in an eternal cycle of destruction and recreation. In anticipation of their own deaths, the older generations give birth and teach the new generations, ensuring a future of freedom and flourishing. The cycle itself is infinite, never ending, yet always has a beginning at the snake's head and its end with the snake's tail, representing birth and death respectively. Life starts at the snake's head and perishes by the tail, only to mark the beginning of a new cycle of the Ouroboros, a new life cycle. The Moebius symbol, on the other hand, derives from the mathematical symbol of the Moebius strip. This strip is a non-orientable surface, meaning that no more than one side is able to be distinguished. By tracing the strip's surface with one's own finger, one would end up looping the strip eternally. The surface of the strip possesses neither beginning nor end, as the eternal now of Moebius possesses neither past nor future, neither memory nor progress. Every point in time during the last 1000 years of Ionios' existence has been the same constant war between Keves and Agnus, wherein the same soldiers fought, perished and were reborn, only to fight and perish yet again. Every temporal point during those 1000 years is identical to any other point, unaltered from that which came before, while not bringing forth anything new. In the same vein that no spatial point on the Moebius strip marks a beginning or end, but merely one undistinctive surface. The Ouroboros snake symbolizes hope in the success of the new cycle, whereas the Moebius strip captures Ionios' nature as the dystopia of stasis. These two symbols appear to be incongruous in their meanings, and yet they are combined in the irises of Noah and Mio. After the M inside of Mio's body perished, the shape of Mio's iris became a fusion of the two symbols, with the Ouroboros' circle pierced by the string of the Moebius. The same happens to Noah's iris after N's body disappears as a result of rejecting the Eternal Now. In both cases, the emergence of this Ouroboros-Moebius fusion takes place after the unification of the Ouroboros and Moebius selves. During these scenes, M and N did not die, but instead merged together with Noah and Mio. This new iris symbolizes that Moebius and Ouroboros now coexist within Noah and Mio, rather than the future or present dominating. During the same cutscene from chapter 7, where N and M were shown to still exist within Noah and Mio. Mio also displays understanding for N's decision to abandon the future to maintain the now.
N, you were just like us once, an Ouroboros fighting for the future. But one day, you gave up on it and made the choice to protect the now. But you know, that's okay too. To protect and to endure. They're shapes a wish can take. And I knew exactly what that meant.
This is reiterated on during the climax of the Set Infinity fight, when M apologizes to the main cast for having become Moebius, clinging to the egotistical dream of being together forever. At this point, Mio replies that such a dream is nothing to be ashamed of, as anyone would wish for that. Noteworthy is not only Mio's rejection of labeling the Moebius desire as malignant, but also M and N's acceptance of that rejection. They instead thank Mio for her kind words, then claim that their sacrifice is necessary still.
But now, our prolonged existence here, it only serves to strengthen those within this frozen moment in time, who would keep it thus.
M and N's acceptance plus M's choice of words mean that Moebius as a desire is not framed as entirely evil by the game. The desire to exist in the now is not evil, but now, in this current moment, it is. By removing the parts of Noah and Mio's soul, the desire to remain in the now, the eternal now, is ended. The now and the then, the present and the future, are not discordant antagonists. They exist within Noah and Mio's bodies, without contradiction, as two parts of one whole. The climax of the game involves the annihilation of their Moebius sides, but this occurs in light of having to make a decision about the future of Ionios. If the two worlds had not been separated, meaning if the present had not been rejected, then all of existence would eventually be erased. In this situation, an immediate decision was necessary, and accordingly, Ouroboros took precedence. The now had to be erased, but only for as long as the decision had to be made. Mio's words to M suggest clearly that it is not a moral failing to exist within the now. Instead, it was the incessant obsession to maintain the now forever that was in dispute. the thing that is dubbed egotistical by M. This is the true meaning of the iris of dual infinitude, of the coexistence of the now and the then. This final reconciliation of Ouroboros and Moebius may appear to be in conflict with how Moebius has been depicted throughout the game. After all, most Moebius that were encountered were unequivocally evil, and the ones who aren't are still framed as victims of poor decision making. Nonetheless, the story refuses to denounce N and M fully for their decision, instead affording them understanding and compassion. The evil of Moebius is the product of Nietzschean monotheism, of temporal absolutism, and of existential disintegration. As antagonists of the main game, they are primarily shown in this corrupted form, but nonetheless the game does not equate this with disavowing Moebius in general. No temporal plane is prioritized over the other. In Future Redeemed, this is shown adequately by making its main villain Alpha, a being who desires to erase all of those living in the present, to create a future rid of the olden ones, olden life and olden notions. Alpha completes a duo of Xenoblade Chronicles 3's antagonists, with both representing extreme embodiments of either Ouroboros or Moebius. Alpha wants a future without the present, and Set the present without a future. The evil lies not in what they desire, but instead in what they abolish. So far, Moebius has been equated with the eternal now and existential despair, but based on the above, Moebius needs to be reconceptualized. The eternal now is not the desire to exist in the now, but to exist as Moebius sans Ouroboros, as living in the now without an eye on the future. Both Moebius and Ouroboros are integral to living. The eternal now has broken the balance between these two modes by only allowing for the present to exist. Those who become Moebius are consumed by fear and desperation. Time controls them. Meanwhile, Noah's defining character moment is his resolve to overcome his desire to maintain the perpetual present shared with Mio. Finding himself in a world where the only smiles that can be shared are those of the departing, Noah recognizes that he has to move forward, even if this leads to a world without Mio. When the dual worlds split again, following the destruction of Moebius, there is no guarantee that the universes will meet again during Noah and Mio's lifetime. The 6 main Ouroboros characters naturally have their own doubts about this, and yet they know that without a future, their shared existences can have no meaning. To enable the generation of meaning, Noah has to overcome any attachment to time. He has to become a temporal overman. Nietzsche's concept of the Übermensch, which I will translate as overman, is the culmination of his philosophy of power. The overman is the human who has awoken his true self by breaking away from conformity and mediocrity. He has done so not by looking inwards, but instead by rising above oneself. The most essential term for understanding Nietzsche's overman is the concept of overcoming. In his seminal work, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Zarathustra begins his first speech by proclaiming that man is something that should be overcome. What have you done to overcome him? Overcoming your human state of being is instrumental in becoming an overman, and to overcome it is to become an overman. The Nietzsche scholar Wouter Kaufmann notes that the Übermensch, at any rate, cannot be dissociated from the conception of Überwindung, of overcoming. More extensively, the German philosopher Ludwig Klages writes about this motive that Zarathustra is an interrupted and uncanny exegesis of the proposition Über, overfullness, overgoodness, overtime, overkind, overwealth, overhero, to overdrink. And they are just as many variations of the one exclusively meant, overcoming. The Über dominates the being of the overman, with all other forms of overcoming from Klages' list serving as examples of particular manifestations of the overman. In Noah's own struggle to overcome himself, he had to become overtime. He had to conquer the conformity of the present and the radicality of the future, together with all of the emotional fears that those temporalities threaten. By becoming overly focused on one event or one state of being, the time at which that focus is situated can start to dominate one's frame of mind. For N, his love for Mio led to him becoming obsessed with the associated time period. That time controlled him, making him Untertime rather than Overtime. Only by rising above time, by becoming Overtime, could Noah properly exist within time. Although the now should be loved for what it is, a celebration of your own existence and past, this should never be done without an eye on how it may impact the future. Simultaneously, the future cannot be the perpetual object of focus, as it risks erasing the ability to enjoy the present. To absolutely prioritize either turns you into a serf of your own desires and surroundings, rather than the master of your life. The merged iris of Moebius and Ouroboros marks Noah and Mio's overcoming of time, ultimately giving the phrase fighting in order to live and living in order to fight its final meaning. Life requires values to be fought for, and values require a life to be enjoyed. Without either, life becomes meaningless. To erase either amounts to erasing life as such.
As the morning sun rises, my lingering memories fade. I no longer see your silhouette. It's too far gone into the haze. But hey, it's all right. I won't forget you. Not until we can meet again. I swear it.